Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. It wasn't the first time the hallway lights flickered. Each day I passed that same corridor, noticing how the bulbs seemed to dim more frequently, but I never replaced them. The air felt colder there, but only if you were paying attention. Papers collected dust on the shelf, each untouched document hinting at something forgot. I noticed a slight indentation on the carpet, as if someone paused there briefly, like a memory dulling over time. I never brought it up with anyone. The window was slightly ajar, but I closed it without looking outside. The lock hadn't changed. I left it as it was. The first dream came on a Tuesday, or maybe it was Wednesday. These things blur together when you're not sleeping well. I found myself standing in a room I'd never seen before, though something about the dimensions felt familiar. The walls were that particular shade of off-white that hospitals use, clean but somehow unsettling. There was a single light above me, circular and steady, casting everything in this soft, even glow. What struck me most was the silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of quiet, if that makes sense. Like the air itself was holding its breath. I turned to leave, but there wasn't a door where I expected one to be. Just more wall, smooth and unbroken. The only thing out of place was a small red light in the corner, blinking slowly. Once every few seconds, patient and rhythmic. I stared at it until I woke up. I dismissed it as stress. Work had been demanding, and I'd been drinking too much coffee, staying up too late scrolling through my phone. The mind processes things strangely when it's overtired. Everyone knows that. But the dream came back. This time I was in the same room, but it felt larger somehow. The ceiling stretched higher, and the walls seemed to breathe with a barely perceptible expansion and contraction. The red light was still there, blinking in that same patient rhythm, but now there was something else. A sound, low and constant, like the hum of machinery running somewhere far below. I tried to move toward the light, but my feet felt heavy, as if I were walking through water. Each step took tremendous effort, and the distance between me and the corner never seemed to change. The humming grew slightly louder, and I could feel it in my chest, a vibration that made my ribs ache. Then I heard the voice. It was metallic, distorted, like someone speaking through an old radio with poor reception. The words were unclear, fragments that might have been my name or might have been nothing at all. Static washed over the sounds, making them impossible to grasp, but there was an urgency to it, a quality that made me strain to listen even as I couldn't understand. I woke up with my heart racing, sheets damp with sweat. The next morning I noticed something strange. There was a small cut on my forearm just below the elbow, a thin line perfectly straight, about 2 inches long. I couldn't remember how I'd gotten it. I checked the sheets, the furniture, anything with sharp edges, but found nothing that could have made such a precise mark. I covered it with a bandage and tried not to think about it. At work, the fluorescent lights in my office began to flicker more frequently. The maintenance staff said they'd look into it, but days passed and nothing changed. The intermittent dimming created a rhythm that reminded me of something, though I couldn't place what. During lunch, I noticed that my phone had been recording audio for over an hour without my knowledge. When I played it back, there was nothing but silence, punctuated by occasional bursts of static. I deleted the file and turned off the automatic recording feature I didn't remember activating. The third dream was different. I was in the same room, but now it felt more real than reality itself. The air had texture, thick and almost tangible. I could taste it, metallic and sharp, like the moment before a thunderstorm. The red light continued its patient blinking, but now there were others. Small points of light scattered across what I now realized wasn't a ceiling, but an endless dark space above. The humming had become a chorus, multiple frequencies layering over each other in complex harmonies. It was beautiful and terrifying, like hearing the universe itself breathing. I felt myself lifting, though my feet remained planted on the floor. The sensation was of being gently pulled upward by invisible hands. The voice returned, clearer now. It spoke in measured tones, each word carefully enunciated, but in a language I didn't recognize. Yet somehow I understood. It was asking questions, patient inquiries about things I couldn't quite remember. My responses came automatically, as if I were reading from a script I'd memorized long ago. Time moved strangely. Conversations that felt like hours compressed into seconds, while single moments stretched into eternities. I was aware of being observed, studied with a clinical detachment that made me feel like a specimen under glass. When I tried to wake up, I couldn't. The dream held me with gentle but absolute authority. I could only wait until it decided to release me. I woke up exhausted, as if I hadn't slept at all. The blighting began during the day. I'd be sitting at my desk or walking down the street when reality would suddenly feel thin, like tissue paper stretched too tight. The familiar world would shimmer at the edges, and for just a moment I'd see that room again. The lights, the endless ceiling, the patient red beacon in the corner. Sounds became suspect. The hum of the air conditioning would modulate into those complex harmonies from the dream. Conversations in nearby offices would fade into metallic whispers that might have been the voice asking its careful questions. I began losing time. I'd sit down to work and suddenly find myself standing in the bathroom with no memory of walking there. I'd start eating lunch and discover the empty container in front of me, though I couldn't recall taking a single bite. My reflection in mirrors looked tired, but there was something else. A quality of attention, as if I were listening to something no one else could hear, which I was beginning to suspect might have been true. The cut on my arm had healed, but others appeared. Always thin, always precise, always in places I might not notice immediately. The inside of my wrist, just above the pulse point. The back of my neck, hidden by hair. The sole of my foot, discovered only when I stepped out of the shower onto the cold tile. I stopped mentioning these things to people. Their concerned looks and gentle suggestions about seeing someone made me realize how the story sounded from the outside. Stress, they said, overwork, a few good nights of sleep would fix everything. But I was afraid to sleep. The fourth dream lasted 3 days. I know that's impossible. I went to work, had conversations, ate meals, but underneath it all, I was still in that room. The experience layered over reality like a double exposure, both worlds existing simultaneously in my awareness. The questions became more specific. The voice wanted to know about the hallway, about the papers on the shelf, about the window I never looked through. It asked about the indentation in the carpet with the patience of someone who already knew the answers but needed to hear them confirmed. I found myself responding with information I didn't remember having. Details about the building's construction, about the people who had worked there before me, about events that had supposedly never happened. The knowledge flowed out of me like water from a broken dam. During those 3 days, people at work commented on my distraction. I'd be in meetings but clearly elsewhere, responding to questions no one had asked, referencing conversations that hadn't occurred. I explained it as fatigue, and they accepted this because the alternative was too complicated to consider. On the third night, I understood something fundamental. The dreams weren't dreams at all. They were memories, carefully buried and slowly surfacing. The room was real. The questions were real. The answers I'd given were real. I just couldn't remember when it had actually happened. The realization should have been terrifying, but instead, it brought an odd sense of relief. The pieces were finally arranging themselves into a pattern, even if I couldn't see the complete picture yet. I began to notice other people who looked tired in the same way I did. They had that quality of distant attention, as if part of them were always listening to something just beyond perception. We'd nod to each other in passing, a recognition that bypassed conscious thought. The building itself seemed different. Corridors I'd walked for years revealed new details. Doors I'd never noticed before, always locked but somehow significant. Stairwells that led to floors that didn't appear on any directory. The flickering lights weren't random. They followed patterns, complex sequences that repeated with mathematical precision. I started mapping them, filling notebooks with timing charts and frequency analyses. The data meant nothing to me, but my hands seemed to know what they were recording. My apartment began to change in subtle ways. Objects appeared in places I hadn't put them. Books I didn't remember buying lined the shelves, their covers worn as if I'd read them many times. The refrigerator hummed in harmonies that matched the sounds from the room. I'd wake up to find windows open that I'd closed the night before. Not just unlocked, but open to specific measurements, as if positioned to catch signals from particular directions. The cut on my arm had left a scar, but under certain lights I could see that it wasn't random. It was part of a pattern, a small mark in what was clearly a larger design. Other scars I'd attributed to childhood accidents revealed themselves as components of the same intricate map drawn on my skin. I stopped trying to explain these things rationally. The rational world had become the aberration, the strange interruption of something much larger and more consistent. The voice began speaking to me during the day, not through dreams, but directly into my awareness. It would comment on my activities with the same clinical interest it had shown in the room. When I ate, it would note my nutritional choices. When I worked, it would observe my problem-solving methods, always studying, always recording. I realized I was answering back, carrying on conversations that must have looked like talking to myself. But the responses came so naturally that it felt more like remembering lines from a play I'd performed countless times. The final dream wasn't a dream at all. I was lying in bed, fully awake, when the ceiling began to dissolve. Not dramatically, but gradually, like fog dissipating in morning sunlight. Beyond it was the endless dark space I remembered, scattered with those patient points of light. The red beacon appeared in the corner of my room, blinking with the same steady rhythm. The humming rose from the floorboards, complex harmonies that made my furniture vibrate in sympathetic resonance. I felt myself lifting, but this time my body came with me. The sensation was gentle but absolute, like being carried by invisible hands with infinite care. My room fell away below, though I could still see it, still feel the sheets beneath me even as I rose toward those scattered lights. The voice spoke clearly now, no longer filtered through static or dream logic. It thanked me for my patience, for my cooperation, for the valuable information I'd provided over what it described as many sessions. It explained that the memories would fade again, as they always did, but that the important details had been preserved. I wanted to ask questions, but I found I already knew the answers. This had happened before many times. The dreams, the bleeding between realities, the slow recognition, the final revelation. It was a cycle, carefully managed and endlessly repeated. As I was lowered back to my bed, the voice assured me that everything would return to normal. The cuts would heal without scarring. The strange objects would disappear from my apartment. The patterns in the lights would become random again. But there would be traces, there always were. Small inconsistencies that my conscious mind would dismiss, but some deeper part would recognize. Seeds for the next cycle, whenever it began. I woke up in my own bed, in my own room, with sunlight streaming through windows I remembered closing. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the small red light in the corner, blinking patiently in the morning brightness. Once every few seconds, steady and rhythmic, casting no shadow and reflecting in no surface. I got up to investigate, but there was nothing there, just the corner of my room, empty and familiar. But the light continued blinking, visible only when I wasn't looking directly at it, present only in my peripheral vision. I left it as it was, story 2. The fabric had settled softly around me. Somewhere between the rustle of woven fibers and the faintest brush of skin, I felt it before I understood it. The air carried a subtle, almost imperceptible chill that prickled at my wrist. My eyes followed the threadwork, tracing lines and intersections until they vanished into shadow. My breath held, but it was more than coolness that seeped in. Something in the room shifted, a gentle pull at the corner of my awareness. The warmth seemed to drain from the space around me, leaving an unsettling quiet. To whoever finds this letter, if anyone ever does, I need you to know that I tried. I tried to forget, to move on, to pretend that nothing changed that day when the fabric fell across my lap like snow. But some things don't let you forget them. They live in the spaces between your thoughts, in the pause before sleep, in the reflection that takes just a moment too long to appear in mirrors. I'm writing this because I can't carry it anymore. The weight of what I saw, what I felt, what I became. Maybe writing it down will make it real enough to leave behind. Maybe it will warn you. Maybe it will just disappear like everything else seems to these days. You have to understand I was normal before, whatever normal means. I had routines, patterns, a life that made sense. I knew the sound my coffee maker made in the morning, the way sunlight hit my kitchen counter, the exact number of steps from my front door to the mailbox. 37, always 37. Now I count them and get 36 or 38. The number changes, but I haven't moved. It started with the fabric. I keep coming back to that moment because it's the only thing that feels solid anymore. The weight of it, the texture against my skin, everything else has become fluid, uncertain. But I remember how it felt when it first touched me, like recognition, like coming home to a place I'd never been. There's a humming now, do you hear it? It started soft, so soft I thought it was the refrigerator or the air conditioning or blood moving through my ears. But refrigerators don't hum in harmonies. Air conditioners don't shift pitch when you're not looking, and blood doesn't sing. The humming follows me, to work, to sleep, into dreams I can't quite remember when I wake. It's there when I brush my teeth, when I'm standing in line at the store, when I'm trying to read but the words keep rearranging themselves on the page. Always just at the edge of hearing, like a conversation in the next room that stops when you try to listen. I've started seeing things in my peripheral vision, Not things exactly, movements, shadows that shouldn't exist because there's nothing to cast them. A flutter of fabric where no fabric should be. I turn my head and there's nothing there, but the air still feels disturbed, still holds the shape of something that was. The worst part is the watching. I feel eyes on me constantly now, but when I look around, everyone seems normal. They go about their business, their lives, their conversations, but sometimes I catch them staring just a little too long. Sometimes they look away just a fraction too quickly. Sometimes they look at me like they're trying to remember where they know me from. My reflection has been acting strange. Not dramatically, I'm not talking about horror movie nonsense. It's subtler than that, more disturbing because it's so small. A delay that lasts half a heartbeat, a tilt of the head that I didn't make. Eyes that seem to be looking at something just behind me, even though I'm looking straight ahead. I tried to take a picture of myself the other day. The camera wouldn't focus. Every shot came out blurred, like I was moving even though I was perfectly still, like I wasn't quite there. My friends have stopped calling. Not all at once, that would be too obvious, too clean. One by one, they've drifted away. Plans get canceled. Messages go unanswered. When I see them in public, they smile and wave, but their eyes slide past me like I'm made of glass, like I'm something they can see through. Maybe I am. The fabric is still with me. I keep it folded in my dresser drawer, wrapped in tissue paper like something precious. Sometimes I take it out and hold it, and for a moment everything feels real again. The humming stops, the watching eyes look away, the world settles back into focus. But only for a moment. I've been having dreams about places I've never been. Rooms with too many doors, hallways that stretch longer than they should, windows that look out onto landscapes that shift when I'm not looking directly at them. In these dreams, I'm always searching for something, or someone, or myself. I wake up with the taste of dust in my mouth and threads under my fingernails. The people in the dreams never speak, but they watch me with the same recognition I felt when the fabric first touched my skin. Like they know me, like they've been waiting for me. They wear clothes that look like they're made from the same material, the same weave, the same impossible softness that seems to exist between the physical world and somewhere else. I think I'm becoming one of them. My skin has been feeling different lately. Not sick, not painful, just thin, like it's not quite containing me the way it used to. Sometimes I catch myself running my fingers along my arms, my face, checking to make sure I'm still solid, still here. The boundaries are blurring, between sleeping and waking, between memory and imagination, between what I am and what I'm becoming. I'll be in the middle of a conversation and suddenly realize I haven't been speaking out loud. I'll reach for a door handle and my hand will pass through it like mist before solidifying again. I'm writing this letter in the spaces between moments, in the pause between one breath and the next. Time moves differently now. Hours pass in minutes. Minutes stretch into eternities. I started writing this morning, but when I look at the clock, it's still the same time it was when I began. Or maybe I started writing this yesterday, or last week, or in a dream I had years ago about writing a letter I would never send. The fabric is calling to me, not with sound. The humming is something else entirely. This is deeper, more fundamental, like gravity, but pulling at something inside me instead of my body. It wants me to put it on, to wrap myself in its impossible softness, to let it settle around me the way it did that first day. I think I know what will happen if I do. I think I've always known. The watchers will stop watching because I'll be one of them. The humming will stop because I'll be part of the harmony. The blurring will stop because I'll be on the other side of the boundary, looking back at the solid world with eyes that recognize but don't quite remember. Maybe that's not so bad, maybe that's where I belong now. Maybe I belonged there all along, and the fabric was just showing me the way home. But I wanted to leave this behind first, this record, this warning, this goodbye, for whoever finds it, if anyone ever does, to tell you that I was here, that I was real, that I tried to stay in your world as long as I could. If you find a piece of fabric someday, soft and strange and impossibly familiar, maybe you'll think of me. Maybe you'll understand that some invitations aren't meant to be refused. Maybe you'll hear the humming and know that you're not alone. Or maybe you'll be smarter than I was. Maybe you'll walk away. Maybe you'll choose to stay solid, stay real, stay in the world where mirrors reflect truly and time moves in straight lines and people remember your name. I can't choose anymore. The choice was made for me the moment the fabric touched my skin, the moment I felt that recognition, that sense of coming home. I'm going to put it on now. I'm going to wrap myself in its softness and let it carry me to wherever I belong. Don't look for me. Don't try to understand what happened. Just remember that I was here and now I'm somewhere else, and maybe that's enough. The humming is getting louder. The watchers are getting closer. The boundaries are dissolving like sugar in rain. I was real once. I hope that matters. I hope you stay real longer than I did. Goodbye. Story 3. I had been fixated on the window where the curtain seemed glued to its frame, refusing even the slightest sway. Outside, the wind whispered secrets between the leaves, a lullaby that failed to soothe. Inside, the room held its breath. Papers lay scattered yet still, mocking the chaos I sensed but couldn't see. My pulse matched the clock's steady tick, each second a reminder of my inertia. The tension thrummed beneath my skin, a melody without a crescendo. Then the curtain lifted slightly as if answering an unspoken question. But only one side, revealing nothing but the absence of what should have been hidden. That's where I am now, where I'll always be, I think. The understanding sits heavy in my chest like swallowed stones. There's no going back from this moment, no pretending I don't know what I know. The room breathes around me, alive with its terrible patience, and I can only sit here and remember how I arrived at this truth, how I followed the thread backward until it led me to something I should have left buried. The curtain moves again, just barely, and I know it's not the wind. Before this final moment, before the curtain's confession, I had been pacing. My feet traced the same path across the hardwood floor, heel to toe, wearing a groove in my sanity if not the wood itself. The papers on the desk seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into patterns that almost made sense. Almost. I remember stopping mid-step, one foot suspended above the floor because I heard it again. That soft, scratching sound like fingernails against fabric. It was coming from behind the curtain, but when I'd checked earlier, there had been nothing there. Just the window, just the glass, just the view of the yard that stretched beyond. But the scratching persisted, patient and rhythmic, like someone keeping time to a song only they could hear. I had pressed my ear to the wall beside the window, feeling the cool plaster against my cheek, and the sound stopped immediately, as if it knew I was listening, as if it was waiting for me to step away before it continued its careful work. That's when I noticed the papers had definitely moved. The one on top, the one with the strange symbols I'd been trying to decipher, was now face down. I hadn't touched it. I was certain I hadn't touched it. Going back further to the moment I first heard the scratching, I was sitting at the desk with my head in my hands. The symbols on the paper swam before my eyes, shifting and rearranging themselves every time I blinked. They weren't quite letters, weren't quite numbers, but something in between that made my brain itch when I tried to focus on them. The scratching had started so softly I thought it was just the house settling. Old places make sounds, I told myself. They expand and contract, wood rubbing against wood, pipes ticking as they cool. But this was different. This was deliberate. This had purpose. I had lifted my head slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might stop the sound before I could identify its source. The scratching came in groups of 3, followed by a pause, then 3 more. Scratch, 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 pause, scratch, 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 like a code, like a message being tapped out in Morse against the other side of something thin. The curtain hung perfectly still during all of this, not even a tremor. But behind it, behind the fabric and the window and the glass, something was working with infinite patience, wearing away at the barrier between outside and in. I remember reaching for the paper, wanting to turn it over and study the symbols again, but my hand stopped halfway. The scratching had changed. Now it was coming from inside the walls themselves, traveling along the wooden frame of the window, following some hidden path through the house's bones. It circled the room slowly, deliberately, taking its time to explore every corner, every joint, every place where one surface met another. That's when I realized the symbols on the paper weren't random at all. They were a map. Earlier that afternoon, before the scratching, before the symbols revealed their purpose, I had been in the basement. The air down there tasted of copper and old earth, thick enough to coat the back of my throat. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just exploring the space I'd inherited along with the house. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, their contents a mystery I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. But one box was already open, the flaps folded back neatly as if someone had been expecting me. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, I found the documents. Page after page of those same symbols, drawn in different hands, different inks, spanning what looked like decades. Some were faded to barely visible scratches, others dark and fresh as if the ink was still wet. At the bottom of the box, beneath all the papers, was a small wooden tool. It looked like a stylus worn smooth by countless fingers, its tip stained black. When I picked it up, it felt warm in my palm, warmer than the cool basement air should have allowed. The weight of it was wrong too heavy for its size, as if it were made of something denser than wood. I had gathered the papers and brought them upstairs to study them properly in the light, but the light in the house seemed to avoid them, casting shadows that fell in the wrong directions, making the symbols harder to read rather than clearer. It was only when I held them near the window, where the curtain filtered the afternoon sun into something softer, that the patterns began to make sense. They weren't just symbols, they were instructions. Before the basement, before I found the box that was waiting for me, I had been walking through the empty rooms of the house. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the walls were hollow, as if there were spaces behind them that shouldn't exist. The house felt larger inside than it had appeared from the street, rooms opening onto other rooms in ways that didn't quite match the blueprint I'd been shown. In what I assumed was the study, I found the desk. It was the only piece of furniture left behind by the previous owner, a heavy oak thing with drawers that stuck when I tried to open them. The wood was scarred with small marks, tiny scratches that formed no pattern I could recognize. They covered the entire surface, overlapping and intersecting like a record of some obsessive activity. The chair behind the desk was pulled out at an angle, as if someone had stood up quickly and never bothered to push it back in. When I sat down, the leather was still warm. Not sun warm, not room warm, but body warm, as if someone had just vacated it moments before I arrived. That's when I noticed the curtain for the first time. It hung perfectly straight, without a single fold or wrinkle, like it had been ironed into place. but there was something about it that made me uneasy, something in the way it seemed to absorb light rather than filter it. The fabric was thick enough that I couldn't see through it to the window beyond, couldn't tell if it was still afternoon or if evening had already begun to fall. I had reached for the curtain then, wanting to pull it aside and let in more light, but my hand stopped just short of the fabric. The air around it felt different, heavier, charged with the kind of electricity that comes before a storm. My fingers tingled with proximity, and I pulled my hand back, choosing instead to work with the dim light that remained. That was my first mistake. I should have opened the curtain then, when I still had the chance, when I still had the choice, before I understood what it was hiding, what it was keeping contained on the other side of the glass. Before I found the house, before I inherited it from a relative I'd never met, I was living in a small apartment across town. The walls were thin and the neighbors were loud, but it was familiar chaos, the kind of noise that comes from people living their lives without mystery or malice. I slept well there, dreamlessly, waking each morning with nothing more troubling on my mind than traffic or weather or the small irritations that make up an ordinary life. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, heavy paper, expensive ink, the kind of formal correspondence that belongs to another century. It informed me that I had inherited property from a distant aunt, a woman whose name I recognized only vaguely from family stories told at gatherings I barely remembered. The letter was signed by a law firm I'd never heard of, with an address that led to an empty office building when I tried to verify it later. But the deed was real, the keys were real. The address led to a house that stood at the end of a street that didn't appear on any map I could find, but existed nonetheless when I drove there to see it for myself. It was a solid house, well maintained, with windows that reflected the sky so perfectly they seemed like mirrors rather than glass. The front door opened before I could use the key. Not dramatically, not with any supernatural flourish, but quietly, naturally, as if the house recognized me and was simply being polite. Inside, the air smelled of lavender and old books, pleasant and welcoming. The floors were clean, the walls freshly painted, everything ready for new occupancy. It was only later, after I'd moved my few belongings in, after I'd spent my first night in the comfortable bed that had been left behind, that I began to notice the small inconsistencies. The way doors I was sure I'd closed would be standing open. The way the temperature in certain rooms seemed to shift without cause. The way my reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes seemed to be looking at something just over my shoulder, something I couldn't see when I turned around. But these were small things easily dismissed. Old houses have their quirks, their personalities. They settle and shift, expand and contract with the weather. They hold on to the habits of their previous occupants like scents in fabric. I told myself these explanations and believed them, because believing them was easier than considering the alternatives. It wasn't until I found the basement, until I discovered the box that was waiting for me, that I began to understand the true nature of my inheritance. Before the letter, before I learned about the aunt I'd never known, there was a dream. I had it 3 nights in a row, always the same, always ending at the moment I tried to wake up. In the dream, I was standing in a room I didn't recognize, looking at a window covered by a heavy curtain. Someone was behind the curtain, someone who knew I was watching, someone who was waiting for me to make the first move. In the dream, I could hear scratching sounds, soft and patient, like someone carving symbols into wood. The sounds came from behind the curtain, but also from inside the walls, from beneath the floor, from above the ceiling. They surrounded me, a symphony of small destructions, each scratch wearing away another piece of the barrier between what was hidden and what was known. I would reach for the curtain in the dream, my hand moving slowly through air that felt thick as water. But I never quite reached it before I woke up, heart pounding, sheets soaked with sweat that smelled faintly of copper and old earth. The dream felt more real than my waking life, more solid and permanent than the apartment where I slept. When I walked through my days, I felt like I was sleepwalking. When I dreamed, I felt like I was finally awake. After the third night, the dream stopped, but the feeling remained, the sense that I was waiting for something, that something was waiting for me. It was a patient feeling, unhurried, like a conversation that had been paused but never ended. I went through the motions of my ordinary life, but I was listening for something, watching for some sign that would tell me what came next. The letter arrived 4 days later. But before the dreams, before the inheritance, before I learned that some gifts come with prices that aren't negotiated in advance, there was a moment. A small moment, insignificant in the way that seeds are insignificant before they grow into trees that split foundations and buckle sidewalks. I was walking past a house I'd never noticed before, on a street I thought I knew well. It was evening, that blue hour when the light fades but darkness hasn't quite arrived. The house was dark except for one window on the second floor, where a curtain glowed softly with lamplight from within. As I watched, a shadow passed across the curtain, just a silhouette, nothing more, but something about its shape made me stop walking. The shadow paused at the window, and I had the distinct impression that it was looking out at me, studying me with the same attention I was giving it. Then the shadow raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. Even from the street, even through the curtain and the distance between us, I could see the outline of fingers spread wide, as if it was trying to push through to the other side, as if the glass was all that stood between us. I should have walked away then. I should have continued down the street and forgotten what I'd seen, dismissed it as a trick of light and shadow, a moment of imagination sparked by fatigue or stress or the simple human tendency to find patterns where none exist. Instead, I raised my own hand and pressed it against the air, matching the gesture of the shadow in the window. For just a moment, I felt something push back, a pressure against my palm as real as another person's touch. The air between my hand and the distant window felt solid, connected, as if we were touching through some medium I couldn't see or understand. Then the shadow stepped back from the window and the connection broke. The curtain fell still, the light went out, and I was alone on the sidewalk with my hand stretched out toward nothing, looking like someone trying to catch snowflakes or grasp at smoke. I lowered my hand and walked home, but I carried the feeling with me. The warmth of that impossible touch lingered on my palm for hours, a phantom sensation that reminded me of promises made and debts incurred, of contracts signed in languages I couldn't read but somehow understood. That was the beginning, that moment of connection, that recognition between shadow and observer, that first acknowledgement that some boundaries exist only as long as both sides agree to honor them. Now sitting in this room with the curtain that moves without wind, with papers that rearrange themselves when I'm not looking, with scratching sounds that map the hidden architecture of the house around me, I understand what I agreed to in that moment on the sidewalk. What I invited in with that gesture, that matching of hand to hand across an impossible distance. The curtain lifts again just slightly, and this time I see what's behind it. Not the window I expected, not the glass that should separate inside from outside, but another room entirely. A room that mirrors this one exactly, down to the scattered papers and the scarred desk and the chair pulled out at an angle. And in that other room, sitting in that other chair, is another version of myself. One that raises its hand when I raise mine, that watches me with eyes that reflect no light, that scratches symbols into the air between us with fingers that move like they're carving into something solid. The scratching sounds have stopped now. The work is complete. The map has been drawn, the instructions have been followed, the invitation has been accepted. What was hidden is now revealed, what was separate is now connected, what was outside is now in. The curtain falls back into place, but it doesn't matter anymore. The barrier was never really there. It was just something I told myself existed, a story I needed to believe until I was ready to see the truth. I am the shadow in the window, I always was. And somewhere on a street I thought I knew well, someone else is walking past a house they've never noticed before, looking up at a window where a curtain glows softly with lamplight from within. They'll see my silhouette against the glass. They'll watch as I raise my hand and press it against the window, fingers spread wide, pushing against the boundary between here and there, between known and unknown, between what is and what might be. And if they're ready, if they're listening for the scratching sounds that map the hidden connections between all things, they'll raise their own hand in response. The cycle continues, the invitation extends. The curtain waits, patient and still, for the next person who needs to learn what lies on the other side of seeing. Story 4. Wasn't the first time I'd noticed the curtains slightly ajar in the study. The draft from the window, subtle yet consistent, made the room a touch cooler than the rest of the house. Books remained undisturbed on the shelves, their spines collecting dust in a way that seemed almost deliberate. The cat didn't wander in there anymore, preferring the warmth of the kitchen. I passed by the room each night, glancing in just long enough to see that everything appeared unchanged. I never bothered to pull the curtains shut. The first dream came on a Tuesday, though I only remember that detail because I'd been particularly tired from work. In the dream, I was lying in my bed, but the room felt different, larger somehow. The ceiling stretched higher than it should have, and there was this soft hum threading through the air, like electricity running through old wires. It was the kind of sound you notice only when everything else goes quiet. Above me, through what should have been solid ceiling, I could see an oval light, not bright, not harsh, just there, pulsing gently like something breathing. The light didn't illuminate anything around it, didn't cast shadows or reveal the source of that endless humming. I remember thinking, even in the dream, that I should be more concerned. But there was this floating sensation, as if gravity had loosened its grip, and I felt strangely peaceful. When I woke up, I dismissed it. Stress does funny things to sleep, and I'd been working longer hours lately. The dream felt thin in daylight like most dreams do, forgettable. But it came back. The second time the dream lasted longer. The humming was clearer now, more purposeful. It rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost like communication, though I couldn't understand what it was trying to say. The oval light pulsed in rhythm with the sound, and I realized I could move my head slightly to watch it. The light shifted position too, staying just within my field of vision no matter which way I turned. That's when I heard the voice. It was metallic, processed, like someone speaking through an old radio with poor reception. The words were there but not quite there, hovering at the edge of comprehension. I strained to listen, but the harder I focused, the more the voice seemed to retreat into static. All I caught were fragments, syllables that might have been my own thoughts echoing back to me. The floating sensation was stronger this time. I felt as though I were being lifted, though my body remained perfectly still. There was a scent in the air too, sharp and clean, like ozone after a thunderstorm, but more artificial, cleaner than anything natural should be. I woke with that metallic taste on my tongue. During the day, I started noticing things, small things. The coffee mug I always left on the kitchen counter was in the sink, washed and dried, though I had no memory of cleaning it. There was a small mark on my forearm, 3 tiny punctures arranged in a perfect triangle, like someone had pressed a small instrument against my skin. The marks didn't hurt, but they were there, real and unexplained. The cat had started acting strangely too. She would sit in the hallway outside the study, staring at the partially opened door with her ears flattened back. When I approached, she would bolt, but I'd often find her there again later, watching that room with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The third dream was different, vivid in a way that made reality feel pale by comparison. This time I wasn't in my bedroom. I was somewhere else entirely, though the oval light remained constant above me. The humming had evolved into something more complex, layered with harmonics that seemed to resonate inside my chest. The voice was clearer too, though still just beyond understanding. It spoke in measured tones, asking questions I couldn't quite hear, waiting for responses I couldn't give. The floating sensation had become complete weightlessness. I drifted in space that had no walls, no floor, no reference points except for that persistent oval light. Time moved strangely here. Minutes felt like hours, or maybe hours compressed into seconds. I had the distinct impression of being observed, studied, though I couldn't see anyone else in this vast, undefined space. There was a moment just before I woke when the voice became almost clear. Almost. It said something about returning, about continuation, about processes that needed completion. The words hung in the air like smoke, dissipating just as I began to grasp their meaning. I woke up exhausted, as if I hadn't slept at all. That's when the contamination began. During quiet moments, I started hearing the humming. Not loudly, not obviously, but there in the background like white noise. It would start when I was reading or washing dishes or sitting in traffic. At first I thought it was appliances or the air conditioning or sounds from outside. But when I tried to locate the source, it would fade, only to return when I stopped looking for it. The oval light began appearing too, glimpses of it in my peripheral vision, always just outside direct sight. I turned my head quickly, trying to catch it, but there would be nothing there except the familiar shapes of my daily life. Lamps, light fixtures, the sun through windows, all perfectly normal and perfectly inadequate explanations for what I was seeing. I started losing time, small chunks at first. I'd be reading a book and suddenly realize I'd been staring at the same page for 20 minutes with no memory of what I'd been thinking about. Or I'd be driving home from work and find myself already in my driveway with no recollection of the journey. The marks on my arm had faded, but new ones appeared, always small, always precise, always in places I wouldn't notice immediately. A tiny circle behind my ear, 3 parallel lines on my ankle, a small diamond shape on my shoulder blade. None of them hurt, none of them made sense. The dreams continued, each one longer and more detailed than the last. In one, I was back in that weightless space, but this time I could see instruments around me. Sleek, unfamiliar devices that hummed with the same frequency I'd been hearing during my waking hours. The metallic voice was asking me questions about my daily routine, my habits, my thoughts. I found myself answering, though I couldn't hear my own responses. In another, I was walking through my house, but it was wrong somehow. The rooms were arranged differently, the furniture wasn't quite right, and there were doorways leading to spaces that shouldn't exist. The oval light followed me from room to room, casting that strange illumination that revealed nothing while somehow making everything visible. The most disturbing dream was the simplest. I was lying in my own bed, in my own room, everything exactly as it should be. But I was watching myself sleep from somewhere near the ceiling, and I could see that I wasn't alone. There were figures standing around the bed, tall and indistinct, observing my sleeping form with the same clinical attention I'd felt in the weightless space. They moved with purpose, adjusting things I couldn't see, making notes I couldn't read. When I woke from that one, I was lying exactly as I'd seen myself in the dream. The boundary between sleeping and waking began to blur. I'd be having a conversation with a coworker and suddenly realize they were speaking with that same metallic quality I'd heard in the dreams. Or I'd look up at the office ceiling and see, for just a moment, that familiar oval light pulsing gently among the fluorescent fixtures. These episodes never lasted long enough for me to be certain they were real, but they were happening more frequently. The humming was constant now, a background soundtrack to my daily life. I'd grown so accustomed to it that silence, when it occasionally occurred, felt wrong and empty. The cat had stopped coming into the house altogether, preferring to stay outside even in bad weather. I began to suspect that what I'd been calling dreams weren't dreams at all. They felt too consistent, too detailed, too purposeful. Real dreams shift and change, logic breaks down, narrative dissolves, but these experiences maintain their own internal consistency. The oval light was always the same size, the same intensity. The humming followed the same patterns. The metallic voice asked similar questions in the same measured cadence. I started keeping a notebook by my bed, trying to record details immediately upon waking. But every morning I'd find the pages blank, though I had clear memories of writing in them. Sometimes my hand would be cramped, as if I'd been writing for hours, but there would be no evidence of what I'd recorded. The marks on my body were appearing more frequently now, always small, always precise, always in new locations. I began to think of them as a kind of mapping, though I couldn't understand what was being mapped or why. Then came the night when everything changed. I was lying in bed, caught in that familiar floating sensation, when I realized I could move more freely than before. I sat up in the weightless space and found myself face to face with the oval light. It was larger now, close enough that I could see it wasn't simply a light source, but something more complex. There were patterns within it, geometric shapes that shifted and rearranged themselves in sequences that seemed meaningful but remained incomprehensible. The metallic voice spoke directly to me for the first time, clear and unmistakable. "The integration is nearly complete," it said. "Do you understand what's happening to you?" I tried to respond, but my voice came out as that same processed, metallic sound. The realization was terrifying and oddly comforting at the same time. I was becoming something else, or perhaps returning to something I'd always been but had forgotten. "The dreams were preparation," the voice continued. "Your consciousness needed time to adjust, to remember. We've been very patient." The oval light pulsed brighter, and suddenly I was back in my bedroom, but I wasn't alone. The tall figures from my previous dream were there, standing quietly around my bed. They weren't threatening, just present, waiting for something. One of them leaned over me, and I could see my own reflection in what might have been its face. But the reflection was wrong. My eyes held that same oval light, pulsing gently in rhythm with my heartbeat. When I woke up, I was lying in my bed, morning light filtering through the curtains. Everything appeared normal, exactly as it should be. But when I got up and walked to the bathroom mirror, I could see the faint glow behind my pupils, barely visible but undeniably there. I went through my morning routine mechanically, the humming in my ears now so familiar it felt like silence. The marks on my body had faded, but I could feel them under my skin, a network of connections I was only beginning to understand. At work, people seemed different, not obviously, but subtly. They moved with slightly more purpose, spoke with slightly more precision. When they looked at me, I sometimes caught that familiar oval reflection in their eyes, gone too quickly to be certain but present long enough to be noticed. I began to understand that I wasn't alone in this experience. The dreams, the marks, the gradual integration, it was happening to others too. We were part of something larger, something that had been quietly expanding, one consciousness at a time. The realization should have been frightening, but instead it felt like coming home. That night I didn't bother getting into bed. I sat in the study, in the chair facing the window with its perpetually open curtains. The cat was outside, watching the house from a safe distance. I could see her eyes reflecting the porch light, two small points of familiar illumination. The humming grew louder, more complex, building towards something that felt like completion. The oval light appeared again, not above me this time, but directly in front of me, hovering just beyond the window. It was larger than before, more detailed, and I could finally see what lay within its shifting patterns. It was a map, not of places, but of connections. Lines of light linking points of consciousness, a network that spanned distances I couldn't comprehend. Some of the connections were bright and steady, others were still forming, pulsing with the rhythm of new integration. I could see my own connection now, a thin thread of light extending from somewhere behind my eyes to join the greater pattern. It was beautiful and terrifying and absolutely inevitable. The metallic voice spoke one final time, though now I realized it was my own voice, processed through systems I was only beginning to remember. "Welcome back," it said, "the work continues." I stood up and walked to the window, reaching out to touch the glass. The oval light pulsed once, brightly, and then faded, but I could still feel its presence, not outside anymore, but within me, part of the network that connected us all. The next morning, I woke up in my bed with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The study looked exactly as it always had, curtains slightly ajar, books undisturbed, everything in its proper place. The cat was back in the kitchen, purring as she ate her breakfast. I went through my morning routine, showered, dressed, prepared for another ordinary day. But as I was leaving for work, I noticed something that made me stop. There on the kitchen counter, where I always left my coffee mug, was a small device I'd never seen before. Sleek, unfamiliar, humming with a frequency that resonated in my bones. It was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as my heartbeat. I picked it up and suddenly the memories came flooding back, not dreams at all, but experiences. Real experiences with real purposes and real consequences. The integration was complete and the work was just beginning. I put the device in my pocket and walked out into the morning light, my eyes reflecting something that hadn't been there the day before. The cat watched me from the window, her pupils dilated with what might have been recognition or fear. The humming followed me as I drove to work, no longer background noise but a symphony of connection, linking me to others who carried their own small devices, their own reflected lights, their own completed integrations. And somewhere behind it all, that oval light pulsed steadily, patient as always, waiting for the next consciousness to begin dreaming of weightless spaces and metallic voices, and the gradual, inevitable understanding that some dreams are memories trying to surface. The work continues, Story 5. It began with a chime, faint and unsteady, like a clock struggling to declare the hour. The sound seeped through the quiet room where only the rustling of old papers was meant to be. Each note seemed to cling to the air, refusing to fade into the walls. I stood in the doorway, the chill of the threshold nipping at my senses. The chime rang again, a touch sharper, tightening my chest with a forgotten tension. It seemed to come from beyond the living room, where the air grew dense with the scent of dust and something metallic. I leaned into the sound, drawn to a mirage of echoes I hadn't consciously acknowledged in years, a melody that shouldn't belong here at all. Yet there it was, undeniable and out of place, resonating with a truth I couldn't escape. I knew this chime well. It marked the passage of time in a place long sealed away. The first dream came like a whisper through cotton. I was standing in a room I didn't recognize, though my feet knew exactly where to step. The walls were that particular shade of pale green that exists only in institutions and forgotten places. There was a light above me, perfectly circular, humming with the steady persistence of electricity flowing through old wires. Nothing more than that, just me, the light, and the sense that something was slightly wrong with the way the shadows fell. I woke with the taste of copper pennies on my tongue and dismissed it as stress. Work had been demanding lately, and my mind was probably just processing the day's tensions through imagery pulled from some half-remembered medical drama. The dream felt thin, like tissue paper, easily torn and forgotten. But it returned. The second time I stayed longer in that pale green room. The light was still there, still humming, but now I could hear something else beneath it. A sound like distant conversation, muffled through thick walls or water. The voices were too far away to understand, but their cadence was familiar, like a song I'd heard in childhood but could no longer name. The circular light began to pulse, not with the irregular flicker of a dying bulb, but with something more deliberate. Each pulse sent a gentle pressure through my chest, as if the light were breathing and I was somehow synchronized with its rhythm. I tried to move toward the voices, but my legs felt heavy, disconnected. The room stretched when I wasn't looking directly at it, becoming longer and narrower, like a hallway that had forgotten its original purpose. When I woke this time, my heart was beating in perfect rhythm with that pulsing light. The synchronization lingered for several minutes before gradually fading back to my normal resting pace. I began to notice things during my waking hours, small things, the way the fluorescent light in my kitchen would sometimes pulse in a pattern that felt familiar, how conversations in neighboring apartments seemed to carry that same muffled quality I'd heard in the dream. I found myself listening for something I couldn't name, straining to catch words that weren't quite there. One morning I discovered a small bruise on my forearm, perfectly circular, about the size of a quarter. I couldn't remember bumping into anything, couldn't recall any injury that would leave such a precise mark. The bruise was a pale green color around the edges, fading to yellow in the center. It didn't hurt when I pressed it, but touching it sent a strange, tingling sensation up my arm, like a mild electrical current. The third dream was different. This time, the room was more than a room. It was a space that breathed and shifted, walls expanding and contracting like the inside of lungs. The circular light had multiplied, becoming a constellation of gentle illumination that followed my movements. I could hear the voices more clearly now, though they still spoke in languages that felt familiar but remained incomprehensible. There was someone else in the room. I couldn't see them, but I could sense their presence like a warm spot in cool water. They were watching me, not with malice, but with something closer to curiosity, professional interest, the kind of attention a scientist might give to a particularly fascinating specimen. I tried to speak, to ask who was there, but my voice emerged as that same muffled sound, as if I were speaking underwater or through thick glass. The presence moved closer, and I felt a gentle pressure on my arm, right where the circular bruise would be when I woke. The light above me intensified, and suddenly I was floating, though nothing had lifted me. My body remained on the ground, but some essential part of me drifted upward, drawn toward those pulsing circles of illumination. The sensation was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, just profoundly alien, like being turned inside out by gentle hands. I woke with the scent of ozone in my nostrils, sharp and clean, like the air after a thunderstorm, but somehow more artificial. The smell lingered in my bedroom for hours, despite the windows being closed and no storm having passed through the area. The contamination began slowly. I would be sitting at my desk, working on mundane tasks, when I'd hear that familiar humming. Not from any electrical device I could identify, but from the air itself, as if the sound were being generated by the space between atoms. I'd look up, expecting to see that circular light, and for just a moment the ceiling would seem farther away than it should be, the walls a shade too green. Electronic devices began to behave strangely around me. My phone would sometimes display a signal strength of 0 bars, while simultaneously receiving calls that consisted only of that muffled conversation I recognized from my dreams. The calls would last exactly as long as it took me to remember where I'd heard those voices before, then disconnect with a soft chime that made my chest tighten with recognition. My reflection in mirrors started to lag just by fractions of a second. I'd move my hand, and my reflected hand would follow a heartbeat later, as if the image were being transmitted from somewhere far away and the signal was taking time to reach me. I began to avoid mirrors, then realized I was unconsciously seeking them out, drawn to witness this small impossibility over and over again. The bruise on my arm faded, but others appeared. Always circular, always in that pale green color, always in places I couldn't remember injuring. They formed a pattern I almost recognized, like constellations viewed from a planet with a different sky. When I traced the pattern with my finger, connecting the bruises like dots in a child's activity book, the shape that emerged made my breath catch in my throat. It was familiar in a way that bypassed conscious memory and spoke directly to some deeper part of my brain. Sleep became unreliable. I would lie in bed, eyes closed, convinced I was dreaming, only to open them and find myself still in my bedroom. But the bedroom would be wrong in subtle ways. The walls would be that institutional pale green, or the ceiling would pulse with gentle light, or I'd hear those muffled voices coming from inside the walls themselves. During these episodes, which I could no longer confidently classify as dreams or waking experiences, I began to remember fragments of something larger. Not memories exactly, but impressions. The sense of being in that green room not once, but many times. The feeling of floating upward toward those lights while gentle hands moved over my body with clinical precision. The sound of my own voice, muffled and strange, answering questions I couldn't quite hear. I started to understand that the presence I felt watching me wasn't malevolent. It was thorough, patient. The attention felt almost caring, in the way a gardener might care for a particularly interesting plant, monitoring its growth and making small adjustments to ensure optimal conditions. The realization came gradually, like water seeping through a crack in a dam. These weren't dreams at all. Dreams don't leave bruises. Dreams don't synchronize your heartbeat with imaginary lights. Dreams don't cause electronic interference or make your reflection lag in mirrors. But if they weren't dreams, what were they? And why could I only access these experiences in fragments, like trying to remember something that had been carefully edited from my conscious mind? I began to suspect that something was being done to me, had been done to me, was continuing to be done to me. The green room wasn't a product of my imagination, but a real place I was somehow visiting or being taken to during what I'd assumed were normal sleeping hours. The gentle presence wasn't a dream figure, but someone real, someone who knew me far better than I knew them. The voices in the walls grew clearer. I could almost make out individual words, though they were in a language that seemed to exist just outside the range of human hearing. The conversations had the rhythm of reports, of data being recorded and analyzed. Sometimes I caught what sounded like my own voice responding, though I never remembered speaking. I tried staying awake, drinking coffee and forcing my eyes open through the long hours of darkness. But consciousness became negotiable. I would be sitting upright in my chair, fully alert, when suddenly I'd be floating in that green space again, those circular lights pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat, while gentle hands examined the pattern of bruises on my skin. The boundaries dissolved entirely. I'd be walking down a normal hallway, and suddenly the walls would be that familiar pale green, stretching longer than any hallway should. I'd be eating lunch and taste that sharp ozone flavor, clean and artificial, cutting through whatever food was in my mouth. I'd be talking to a colleague and hear my voice emerge with that underwater quality, muffled and strange, while their response came as those incomprehensible but familiar syllables I'd been hearing in the green room. The bruises began to form more complex patterns, spiraling up my arms and across my torso in designs that hurt to look at directly. Not because they were ugly, but because they were too meaningful, too deliberate, like equations written on my skin in a mathematics I wasn't supposed to understand. I started to remember more during these episodes. The feeling of being lifted, not by force, but by some technology that made gravity irrelevant. The sensation of light passing through my body, mapping every cell and cataloging every thought. The gentle voice that spoke in those almost familiar syllables, asking questions that my muffled responses seemed to answer with perfect comprehension. Most disturbing of all, I began to remember feeling grateful. During these experiences, whatever they were, I felt a profound sense of purpose, of being part of something larger and more important than my mundane daily existence. The attention I received felt like love, if love could be clinical and thorough and completely impersonal. But when I returned to normal consciousness, that gratitude curdled into something closer to horror. What kind of experience could make someone grateful for being examined like a laboratory specimen? What had been done to my mind to make me compliant during these episodes? The answer came in fragments, like trying to remember a conversation overheard in another room. I had been selected, not randomly, but according to criteria I didn't understand. The examinations weren't medical in any conventional sense, but something more fundamental. They were studying not just my body, but the relationship between my consciousness and the physical world, mapping the precise mechanisms by which awareness created reality. The green room wasn't just a room, but a space specifically designed to exist between normal reality and something else. The pale green walls weren't painted that color, but seemed to generate it, as if the hue were a byproduct of whatever technology kept the space stable between dimensions. The circular lights weren't illumination, but sensors, monitoring the fluctuations in my bioelectric field as my consciousness was carefully adjusted and examined. I was part of a study, though the researchers weren't human in any way I could comprehend. Their presence felt vast and patient, like mountains or deep ocean currents. They had been conducting this research for longer than human civilization had existed, gathering data on the nature of consciousness from thousands of subjects across countless worlds. The bruises weren't injuries but markers, each one indicating a specific neural pathway that had been mapped and recorded. The pattern they formed on my skin was a three-dimensional representation of my consciousness itself, a topographical map of my mind rendered in pale green and yellow marks that would fade just as I began to understand their significance. But even this understanding felt suspect, like a memory that had been carefully implanted to replace something more disturbing. How could I trust any of these revelations when my very capacity for memory had been compromised? How could I know which thoughts were my own and which had been suggested by those gentle, thorough hands working in the space between sleep and waking? The chime returned, faint and unsteady, like a clock struggling to declare the hour. I was standing in my kitchen, making coffee, when the sound seeped through the quiet morning air. Each note clung to the atmosphere, refusing to fade into the familiar walls of my home. I followed the sound toward the living room, where the air grew dense with the scent of dust and something metallic. But this time, when I reached for the light switch, my hand passed through it as if it weren't there at all. The switch existed, solid and real, but my hand existed somewhere else entirely, in a space where light switches were unnecessary because the illumination came from perfect circles embedded in a pale green ceiling that stretched impossibly high above me. I looked down at my arms and saw the bruises forming in real-time, pale green circles blooming on my skin like flowers opening to an alien sun. The pattern was nearly complete now, spiraling up my arms and across my chest in a design that hurt to perceive directly. Each new mark sent a gentle tingling sensation through my nervous system, like a tuning fork being struck inside my bones. The muffled voices were clearer now, speaking in syllables that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull. I understood every word, though I couldn't translate them into any human language. They were discussing my progress, noting the successful integration of monitoring systems, commenting on the remarkable stability of my consciousness during the transition phase. I tried to speak to ask what was happening to me, but my voice emerged in those same alien syllables, fluent and confident, as if I'd been speaking this language my entire life. I was reporting on my subjective experience, describing the sensation of existing simultaneously in multiple realities, confirming that the boundary dissolution was proceeding according to established parameters. Part of me was terrified, but a larger part felt that familiar gratitude, the profound sense of purpose that came with being selected for something so much more significant than ordinary human existence. I was helping them understand the nature of consciousness itself, contributing to research that would advance their comprehension of how awareness creates and sustains reality across infinite dimensions. The green room solidified around me, though I never left my kitchen. Both spaces existed simultaneously, occupying the same coordinates but in different layers of reality. I could see my coffee mug sitting on the counter, but I could also see the examination table where my body lay motionless while those gentle, thorough hands continued their work. The circular lights pulsed in perfect synchronization with my heartbeat, and I realized they had always been synchronized, that my heart had been beating to their rhythm for longer than I could remember. The examination wasn't something that happened to me occasionally during sleep, but something that was happening constantly, in a layer of reality that existed just beneath ordinary consciousness. I had never stopped being in that green room. Every moment of my normal life was just a shallow dream floating on the surface of this deeper reality, where I lay perfectly still, while beings of vast intelligence mapped every neuron and cataloged every thought. The bruises on my skin were the only evidence that sometimes seeped through from the deeper layer, physical proof of an examination that was always in progress. The chime rang again, and I understood that it wasn't marking the passage of time, but the completion of another phase in their research. My consciousness had been successfully integrated into their monitoring systems, and I was now broadcasting my subjective experience directly to their instruments, providing real-time data on how awareness functioned when it believed itself to be free and independent. I looked at my reflection in the kitchen window and saw myself lying on the examination table, those gentle hands moving over my motionless form, while the circular lights recorded every fluctuation in my neural activity. My reflection looked back at me and smiled, and I realized that the lag I'd been noticing wasn't a transmission delay, but the time it took for my consciousness to process the fact that I was observing myself from outside my own body. The coffee mug in my hand was perfectly solid and real, but when I set it down, my hand passed through the counter as if both the mug and the surface were projections. Everything was real, but real in different layers, different frequencies of existence that were slowly being harmonized by the research process. I understood now that I would never wake up from this because I had never been asleep. The green room was my true location, and everything else was just data being fed to my consciousness to keep it stable during the examination. But the data was becoming corrupted, the boundaries between layers dissolving as their research reached its final phase. The voices in the walls spoke my name, though it wasn't a name I recognized. It was the designation they had given me when I was first selected, a combination of syllables that described my specific type of consciousness and my role in their study. I responded to it automatically, confirming my continued stability and reporting on the successful integration of multiple reality layers. The chime rang one final time, and I felt something fundamental shift in my perception. The kitchen around me became translucent, like a photograph slowly fading in sunlight. Through the dissolving walls, I could see the true extent of the research facility, vast and green, and filled with thousands of examination tables where other subjects lay motionless, their consciousness broadcasting data to instruments I couldn't begin to comprehend. But as the familiar reality faded away entirely, leaving me floating in that green space with its constellation of circular lights, I noticed something that shouldn't have been possible. There, on the examination table next to mine, was the coffee mug I had just set down in my kitchen. Perfectly solid, still warm, with a small chip on the handle that I'd noticed for the first time this morning. The mug sat there, impossibly real in a space that existed between dimensions, and I realized that something had gone wrong with their research. The boundaries they were trying to map and control were breaking down in ways they hadn't anticipated. Reality was bleeding through their carefully constructed examination environment, bringing physical objects from the projected layer into the deeper truth of the green room. I reached for the mug and my hand was solid again, no longer passing through surfaces but grasping something undeniably real. The ceramic was warm against my palm, and I could smell the coffee, rich and familiar and completely out of place in this sterile research environment. The gentle hands paused in their examination, and I felt a flutter of something that might have been concern from the vast intelligence that had been studying me. This wasn't supposed to happen. The coffee mug wasn't part of their projection, wasn't data being fed to my consciousness to maintain stability. It was a real object that had somehow crossed between layers of reality, proof that the boundaries they thought they controlled were more fragile than they had understood. I smiled and took a sip of the coffee, tasting something that was simultaneously the familiar morning blend from my kitchen and something else entirely. Something that existed only in the space between realities, where consciousness touched the fundamental structure of existence and left permanent marks that even their advanced technology couldn't erase or control. Story 6. The clock ticked, but the hour hand hesitated, caught between numbers. This morning's shower lasted longer, the water too cold despite the dial's usual setting. The mirror fogged before I entered, steam swirling with unheard whispers. On the dining table, the folded newspaper had an additional crease, pointing astray like a compass gone awry. I traced its line with my finger, seeking the fold's origin. In my hand, the paper felt heavier, the ink smelling faintly of lilacs. I turned the page back. The crease remained, stubborn and unchanged, leading nowhere I understood. These disturbances follow me now, small but persistent reminders that something fundamental shifted in my world. The refrigerator hums in frequencies I've never noticed before, harmonizing with an undertone that seems to emanate from the walls themselves. At night, I find myself checking the locks twice, then 3 times, my fingers lingering on the cold metal as if it might reveal some hidden truth about what's coming next. Sleep has become a negotiation rather than a refuge. I lie awake listening to the house settle, but the sounds feel deliberate now, purposeful. The floorboards creak in patterns that suggest footsteps, though I know I'm alone. My phone charges on the nightstand, its screen occasionally illuminating without notification, casting brief rectangles of blue light across the ceiling. During these moments, the room feels observed, as if unseen eyes are cataloging my movements, my breathing, the way I pull the blankets closer to my chin. The dreams, when they do come, carry the weight of memory rather than imagination. I wake with the taste of copper in my mouth and the lingering sensation that I've been somewhere else entirely. My sheets are damp with perspiration that smells faintly of ozone, the same scent that clings to the air after lightning strikes too close. Friends suggest stress, overwork, the usual explanations that people offer when they can't understand what you're trying to tell them. But stress doesn't explain why my coffee maker starts brewing before I enter the kitchen, or why the radio occasionally picks up voices speaking in measured, rhythmic tones that don't quite sound human. The most unsettling part isn't the phenomena itself, but the growing certainty that these aren't random occurrences. They feel like echoes of something larger, ripples spreading backward from an event that changed everything. I catch myself staring at the sky more often now, searching for movement among the stars, waiting for something to return. The waiting has become its own kind of torment, a constant tension in my chest that builds throughout each day until I can barely breathe. I remember now the moment when everything crystallized into something I couldn't deny or rationalize away. It happened during what should have been the deepest part of the night, when the world typically surrenders to silence. I was standing at the kitchen window, drawn there by a sound I couldn't identify, a low thrumming that seemed to pulse through the ground itself. The glass was cold against my forehead as I pressed close, trying to locate the source of the vibration. That's when I saw it. The figure stood at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still against the darkness. At first I thought it might be a person, perhaps someone lost or in need of help, but as I watched, the wrongness of its presence became undeniable. It was too tall, too motionless, existing in the landscape like a shadow cast by nothing. The thrumming grew stronger, and I realized the sound was connected to this presence, emanating from it like a heartbeat made audible. I couldn't move away from the window. My breath fogged the glass in quick puffs as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure's outline seemed to shift subtly, as if it existed slightly out of phase with reality. When I blinked, it appeared to be in a different position, though I never saw it move. The sensation of being observed was overwhelming, a pressure behind my eyes that made my vision blur at the edges. Then the lights appeared overhead. They moved with purpose across the sky, not following the predictable paths of aircraft or satellites. These lights pulsed in coordination with the thrumming, creating a symphony of sight and sound that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to some primitive part of my brain. I watched them dance above the tree line, above the motionless figure, above my house, and I understood with absolute clarity that I was witnessing something that shouldn't exist in my ordered world. The figure turned toward my window. I couldn't make out features, couldn't determine if it even had a face in any conventional sense, but I felt its attention focus on me with laser precision. The thrumming intensified until it seemed to originate from inside my own chest, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat. The lights overhead began to descend, growing brighter as they approached, casting everything in a pale, ethereal glow that made the familiar landscape look alien and hostile. I tried to step back from the window, but my body wouldn't respond to my commands. The glass began to vibrate under my forehead, a gentle buzzing that gradually increased until I could feel it in my teeth, my bones, the spaces between my thoughts. The figure raised what might have been an arm, a gesture that seemed both greeting and command, and something inside my mind went quiet and still. The memory fragments after that point, breaking into disconnected impressions that refused to form a coherent narrative. I remember the taste of metal filling my mouth, the sensation of floating without leaving the ground, voices that spoke in harmonies rather than words. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing until I lost all sense of duration. The lights were closer, so close I could see intricate patterns moving within them like living circuitry, and the figure was no longer at the tree line, but somehow present in multiple locations simultaneously. When awareness returned, I was lying on the kitchen floor, the tiles cold against my cheek. The window showed only ordinary darkness, the kind that belongs to normal nights in normal places. But the thrumming had left an echo in my bones, and the taste of metal lingered for days afterward. I told myself it had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by fatigue or stress, but the explanations felt hollow even as I spoke them aloud to my reflection. Going back further now, I can trace the subtle signs that preceded that night, clues I dismissed at the time as coincidence or imagination. The electronic disturbances began weeks earlier, small glitches that seemed insignificant in isolation. My laptop would freeze while displaying patterns that looked almost like language, geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. The television occasionally picked up signals that weren't quite static, voices speaking in those same rhythmic tones I would later recognize during the encounter. The house itself began to feel different, as if its familiar spaces were slowly being redefined by an intelligence that operated according to different rules. Rooms felt larger or smaller depending on the time of day, and shadows fell at angles that defied the position of light sources. I started losing time in small increments, finding myself in rooms with no memory of walking there, holding objects I didn't remember picking up. The smells were perhaps the strangest part. That ozone scent would appear without warning, usually in the early evening hours, accompanied by an underlying note of something floral and cloying. It would linger for minutes at a time before dissipating, leaving behind only the faintest trace that made me question whether I had imagined it. Sometimes I would wake to find the scent clinging to my clothes, my hair, my skin, as if I had been somewhere else during the night. My sleep patterns began to shift without conscious decision on my part. I found myself staying awake later, drawn to windows and doorways, listening for sounds that never quite materialized. When exhaustion finally claimed me, my dreams were filled with images of vast spaces and distant lights, conversations conducted in frequencies just below the threshold of understanding. I would wake feeling more tired than when I had gone to sleep, with the persistent sensation that I had been traveling great distances while my body remained in bed. The earliest sign, the one I can now recognize as the beginning of everything, was so subtle I nearly missed it entirely. I was sitting in the backyard during what must have been early evening, enjoying the simple pleasure of watching the sky transition from day to night. The air was still and warm, carrying the familiar sense of grass and earth that had always brought me comfort. That's when I first noticed the vibration. It was barely perceptible at first, a tremor in the ground so faint I thought it might be my imagination. But as I sat quietly, paying attention to the sensation through the soles of my feet, I realized it was real and rhythmic, like a massive heartbeat pulsing deep beneath the earth. The vibration seemed to be centered somewhere beyond the tree line, in the direction where I would later see the figure standing in perfect stillness. I pressed my palm flat against the ground, feeling the pulse travel up through my arm and into my chest. There was something hypnotic about the rhythm, something that made my breathing slow and my thoughts drift toward subjects I couldn't quite grasp. The evening light took on a different quality, softer and more diffuse, as if the air itself had become a lens that bent reality in subtle ways. A metallic taste began to develop on my tongue, faint but persistent, like the flavor of old coins or blood. I touched my lips, expecting to find some explanation, but there was nothing there except the growing certainty that something fundamental was about to change in my quiet, ordinary world. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, pinpricks of light in the deepening blue, but they seemed brighter than usual, more present somehow. I found myself staring upward, waiting for something without knowing what, feeling the vibration pulse through my body in perfect synchronization with the rhythm of my heart. The metallic taste grew stronger, and somewhere in the distance, just at the edge of hearing, a sound began to build that would soon become impossible to ignore. But before all of that, there had been peace. Perfect, unsuspecting peace that I can now see was merely the calm before a storm I never could have imagined. I had been living in a world where clocks kept proper time, where mirrors fogged only when warm breath met cold glass, where newspapers folded along predictable lines that pointed toward nothing more mysterious than the day's mundane concerns. That world is gone now, replaced by one where every ordinary moment carries the potential for extraordinary disruption. They're still watching, still waiting, and I know with absolute certainty that what happened that night was not an ending, but a beginning that continues to unfold in ways I'm only starting to understand. Story 7. I told them I'd only stayed outside. The air was crisp, a hint of pine swirling around as it always did this time of year. They believed me easily, jotting down my words as routine. Yet beneath my nails, the dirt darkened, not from the garden but finer, as if pulled from somewhere untouched for far too long. My sleeves hid smears that bloomed like ink in water. The porch light flickered, casting uneven shadows on my shoes that weren't scuffed when I'd first stepped out. The distant hum of the town seemed to pause when I caught my reflection in the window. It knew. The night was louder than usual, but only I seemed to notice. My coat was still damp. The first dream came on a Tuesday, I think, or maybe it was Wednesday. Days blur when you're not sleeping well, and I hadn't been sleeping well for weeks. Work stress, they call it, normal adult concerns. The dream itself was simple, almost boring. I was lying in my bed, exactly where I actually was, staring at the ceiling. Everything looked right. The same water stain shaped like a continent I couldn't name. The same crack running from the corner like a hairline fracture in glass. But there was a light. Not from my bedside lamp, which was off. Not from the street light outside, which had been broken for months. This light was different, oval-shaped, hovering somewhere above me, pulsing with the rhythm of slow breathing. It didn't illuminate anything else in the room, just existed there, patient and unblinking, like an eye that had learned to glow. I woke up feeling foolish. Dreams about lights aren't exactly profound. I made coffee, went to work, forgot about it entirely until the next night when it happened again. The second time, the dream lasted longer. I was in the same position, same room, same ceiling, but now I could hear something beneath the silence. A constant hum, low and steady, like someone was modulating a frequency only I could hear. The oval light pulsed in rhythm with this sound, and I realized I could feel it too. Not just see it, not just hear it, but feel it pressing against my skin like warm static. I tried to move in the dream, tried to sit up or turn my head, but my body wouldn't respond. Not paralyzed exactly, more like I was being held gently but firmly in place. The humming grew clearer, and underneath it I caught fragments of something else. A voice, maybe, metallic and distant, speaking words that dissolved before I could understand them. The light began to move, not quickly but with purpose, drifting from directly above me to hover near the foot of the bed. As it moved, shadows shifted in ways that didn't make sense. The light should have illuminated the wall behind it, but instead, the wall seemed to absorb the glow, becoming darker rather than brighter. I woke up with my heart racing, sheets damp with sweat. The room was exactly as it should be. No lights, no humming, no metallic voices, just the familiar darkness and the sound of my own breathing. I laughed at myself, stressed dreams, nothing more. Maybe I needed to cut back on caffeine. But when I got up to use the bathroom, I noticed something odd. There was dirt under my fingernails. Fine, pale dirt that I didn't remember getting there. I must have worked in the garden and forgotten to wash my hands properly. These things happen when you're tired. The third dream came 2 nights later, and this time I was ready for it. I'd gone to bed early, determined to get proper rest. I'd even taken a warm bath, done some light reading, all the sleep hygiene recommendations I'd found online. None of it mattered. The dream pulled me down like water closing over my head. Same room, same position, but now everything was more vivid than my actual waking life. I could see individual dust motes floating in the air, could feel the texture of my pillowcase against my cheek with impossible clarity. The oval light was there immediately, no gradual appearance this time. It hung above me like it had been waiting. The humming was louder now, and I could distinguish layers within it. Multiple frequencies weaving together, creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible. The metallic voice was clearer too, though still not quite understandable. It spoke in steady, measured tones, like someone reading from a script. But the strangest part was the smell, sharp and clean, like ozone after a storm, but more artificial, clinical. It filled my nose and throat, tasting of metal and electricity. I tried to place it, tried to remember where I might have encountered something similar, but the memory slipped away each time I reached for it. The light began to pulse faster, and I felt myself being lifted. Not physically, my body remained pressed against the mattress, but some other part of me was rising, floating upward toward that oval glow. As I got closer, I could see that it wasn't just light. There were patterns within it, geometric shapes that shifted and reformed like living mathematics. I woke up gasping and immediately knew something was wrong. My bedroom window was open. I never slept with the window open, especially not during the cooler months. The screen was pushed outward, hanging at an odd angle. Cold air flowed across my skin, carrying that same sharp ozone scent from the dream. I told myself I must have opened it during the night without remembering. Sleepwalking, maybe. People do strange things when they're not getting proper rest. I closed the window, straightened the screen, and tried to forget about it. But over the next few days, I started noticing other things, small discrepancies that nagged at me. My car keys weren't where I'd left them. My coffee maker was unplugged in the morning, though I distinctly remembered using it the night before. The radio in my kitchen kept switching to stations I'd never listened to, stations that seemed to play nothing but static with occasional bursts of that same metallic voice. I began to lose track of time. I'd sit down to eat breakfast, and suddenly it was afternoon. I'd start reading a book and find myself staring at the same page for hours, though I couldn't remember what I'd been thinking about. My reflection in mirrors looked tired, older somehow, with shadows under my eyes that hadn't been there before. The fourth dream was different. I wasn't in my bedroom this time. I was lying on something cold and smooth, like polished metal. The ceiling above me was higher, and the walls, if there were walls, disappeared into darkness beyond my vision. The oval light was still there, but now it was one of many, dozens of them arranged in perfect geometric patterns, all pulsing in unison. The humming had become a symphony, complex harmonies that seemed to resonate in my bones, making my teeth ache and my vision blur. The metallic voice was speaking constantly now, words flowing over me like water. I still couldn't understand the language, but I began to recognize the rhythm, the cadence. It was familiar, like a song I'd heard in childhood but couldn't quite remember. I could move in this dream, or thought I could. When I turned my head, I saw others lying on similar surfaces, motionless figures in the distance, too far away to make out clearly. They might have been sleeping, they might have been something else. Time moved strangely here. I felt like I was experiencing hours, days, maybe longer. The lights would brighten and dim in cycles that might have been artificial days and nights. The voice would speak, then pause, then begin again with what sounded like the same words. I began to understand that I was being told something important, something I needed to remember, but the meaning stayed just out of reach. When I woke up, my bedroom felt impossibly small and dim. The familiar objects around me looked foreign, like props in a play I'd forgotten I was performing in. I stumbled to the bathroom and found a small, circular mark on my arm, perfectly round, about the size of a coin, with a tiny puncture in the center. It didn't hurt, but the skin around it was slightly discolored, as if it was healing from something I couldn't remember. I made an appointment with my doctor, told them I'd been having trouble sleeping. They prescribed mild sedatives and suggested I might be experiencing stress-related symptoms. Perfectly normal, they assured me. Nothing to worry about. The mark on my arm was probably just an insect bite. But the dreams continued, sedatives or not. Now they came every night, and the line between sleeping and waking began to blur. I'd be sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee, when I'd hear that familiar humming. I'd look up to see the oval light reflecting in my window, though when I turned around, nothing was there. The metallic voice would whisper from my radio, my television, even from the static of unplugged electronics. I started finding things, small objects that didn't belong to me, made of materials I couldn't identify. Smooth, geometric shapes that felt warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate slightly when I held them. I discover them in my pockets, in my drawers, sometimes just sitting on my kitchen counter like someone had placed them there while I wasn't looking. My neighbors began to avoid me, not obviously, but I noticed the way they'd hurry inside when they saw me coming, the way conversations would stop when I walked by. Once I overheard two of them talking about the strange lights they'd seen around my house at night, lights that I never remembered turning on. The dreams and reality were becoming the same thing. I'd be lying in that cold, metallic place, listening to the voice speak its incomprehensible words, and then I'd blink and be back in my bedroom. But the transition was seamless now, no jarring awakening, no sense of relief, just a continuous experience that shifted between locations like scenes in a movie. I began to suspect that these weren't dreams at all, that something had been happening to me, something I wasn't supposed to remember. The marks on my skin multiplied, small circular punctures that appeared and healed in cycles. The strange objects accumulated in my house like gifts from a secret admirer. The humming became a constant companion, always there at the edge of my hearing. I tried to research to find explanations, but my computer would malfunction whenever I searched for certain terms. The screen would fill with static, and that metallic voice would emerge from the speakers, speaking those same rhythmic, incomprehensible words. My phone would do the same thing, calls cutting out, messages disappearing before I could read them completely. The people I'd spoken to, the ones who jotted down my words so routinely, seemed less real now. Like actors who'd forgotten their lines, going through motions without understanding their purpose. They'd ask the same questions, write down the same answers, and never seem to notice that we'd had these exact conversations before. I realized I was being prepared for something. The dreams, the voice, the objects, they were all part of a process, teaching me, changing me, making me ready for whatever came next. The knowledge was there, just beneath the surface of my consciousness, waiting for the right moment to emerge fully. Last night I had the dream again, the first one exactly as it had been weeks or months ago. I was lying in my bed, staring at the ceiling with its familiar water stain and hairline crack. The oval light appeared above me, pulsing with that slow, breathing rhythm, simple and almost boring, just like the first time. But when I woke up this morning, there was something different, something that couldn't be explained away as stress or sleepwalking or coincidence. The water stain on my ceiling was gone, the crack had vanished. The ceiling was perfectly smooth and white, as if it had been recently repaired. But I've never had any work done on my house. And as I stare up at this impossibly perfect ceiling, I can still see the oval light's reflection in its surface, pulsing gently, waiting for tonight to come again. The humming has started, story 8. I'm trying to remember, the coffee smell, it comes back to me sometimes when I'm not expecting it. Not the warm kind you'd want on a cold morning, but something bitter underneath, metallic, like pennies left in rain. The blinds were half drawn. I know this because I can see those lines of light when I close my eyes, slicing across everything in perfect parallel strips. But I can't remember if I drew them that way or if someone else did. The dust was dancing. I remember thinking how strange it was that dust could look so alive when everything else felt so still. There was a book missing from the shelf. I know this with absolute certainty, though I can't recall which book it was or why it mattered. The gap between the other books looked like a missing tooth, dark, wrong. I stared at that empty space for what felt like hours, but time wasn't working properly then. The humming started before that, or maybe after. Memory doesn't follow rules anymore. It came from somewhere deep, like it was rising up through the floorboards. Not mechanical, not electrical, something organic, alive. The sound would build and fade, matching a rhythm I couldn't identify but somehow recognized. My bones recognized it. That's the only way I can describe it. I remember touching my arm and finding it damp, not sweat, something else. Something that left a residue between my fingers that I kept rubbing away, but it wouldn't go. The smell of metal got stronger when I touched that dampness. My skin felt too tight, like it was shrinking. There was a door, I can see it clearly now, though I couldn't tell you where it led. Light leaked around its edges, not warm daylight, but something colder, bluer. The light pulsed in time with the humming, and I knew I shouldn't open that door. Every instinct screamed against it, but I also knew I had already opened it, or would open it. Time was folding in on itself. The footsteps weren't mine. They echoed from somewhere I couldn't place, soft but deliberate, bare feet on wood. The sound came from above, then below, then inside my own head. I would hold my breath and listen, trying to track their direction, but they seemed to circle without moving. I found myself standing in the kitchen, though I don't remember walking there. My hand was on the coffee maker, still warm. The pot was full, but I hadn't poured any. Someone had been there recently. Someone had made coffee and left it for me to find. The metallic smell was strongest here, mixing with the coffee until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The refrigerator hummed, not the same hum from before, but it triggered something. A flash of memory that wasn't quite memory. A figure standing motionless in the corner of my vision. When I turned to look directly, nothing, but the impression remained, tall, watching, patient. I checked the locks on the doors, all secure, windows too, but security felt meaningless when I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I was trying to keep out was already inside, had always been inside. The house felt smaller than it should, like the walls were slowly moving inward. The shower was running upstairs. I could hear the water hitting the tiles, steady and rhythmic, but I lived alone, had always lived alone. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking in a pattern that seemed deliberate, musical. The bathroom door was closed. Steam seeped underneath it, carrying that metallic scent stronger than ever. I stood outside that door for a long time. The water kept running. Behind the sound, I thought I heard something else. Breathing, slow and deep, not quite human. I pressed my ear to the door and the breathing stopped. Everything stopped, even the water. The silence was worse than the sounds. When I finally opened the door, the bathroom was empty, dry. The shower hadn't been running at all, but the mirror was fogged with condensation that formed patterns I almost recognized. Symbols, or maybe just random moisture. I wiped it clean, but the patterns remained underneath, etched into the glass itself. The book, I remember now what was missing. It was a journal, my journal. Pages filled with my handwriting, documenting days I couldn't quite remember living. Entries that described events I was certain hadn't happened. Or had they? The line between memory and imagination had blurred beyond recognition. I found pages scattered throughout the house, torn from the journal and hidden in strange places, under the couch cushions, inside the coffee canister, taped to the underside of drawers, my own handwriting, but the words felt foreign, descriptions of conversations with people who didn't exist, accounts of places I'd never been, or had I. One page described the humming in detail, how it started soft and grew louder each day, how it seemed to come from inside the walls, then inside my head, how it made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The handwriting grew shakier as the entry progressed, until the final lines were barely legible. Another page was just the same phrase repeated over and over. It's still here, it's still here, it's still here. The words filled both sides of the paper, growing smaller and more frantic toward the bottom. I don't remember writing any of it. The basement door was open. I never opened the basement door. The hinges were rusted shut, had been for years, but there it stood, gaping like a mouth. Cool air drifted up from below, carrying scents of earth and decay and something else, something sweet and wrong. I descended the stairs with my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. Each step down felt like sinking deeper into something I wasn't meant to disturb. The walls were wet with condensation that reflected my light in strange ways. The reflections didn't always match my movements. There was furniture down there I didn't recognize. A chair facing the wall, a table set for two, plates with food that looked fresh despite the basement's dampness. The food was arranged carefully, artistically. Someone had been living down there, or something had been pretending to live. The humming was loudest here. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, vibrating through the concrete and into my bones. I followed the sound to the far corner where the foundation met the earth. There was a crack in the wall, not wide but deep. The humming poured out of it like a living thing. I pressed my eye to the crack and saw movement in the darkness beyond, something large shifting in a space that shouldn't exist. The movement was rhythmic, matching the hum, breathing. The thing on the other side was breathing, and its breath was what I'd been hearing all along. When I pulled back from the crack, my eye was wet, not tears, something thicker, the dampness from earlier. I wiped it away, but it kept coming, streaming down my cheek like the wall itself was crying through me. I ran upstairs and slammed the basement door, found a chair and wedged it under the handle, but I could still hear the humming, fainter now but persistent. It followed me through the house, a constant reminder that something was wrong, had always been wrong. The missing book was on my bedside table when I woke up, or thought I woke up. The journal intact as if it had never been torn apart, but the pages were different now, filled with entries I didn't remember writing, descriptions of dreams that felt more real than waking, accounts of conversations with my own reflection. The final entry was dated today, in my handwriting, but I hadn't written it. The words described everything I'd experienced, but from the perspective of someone watching me experience it, someone who knew what was coming next. The humming will stop soon, it read, but only because it's finished calling. What it was calling to has finally arrived. The missing piece has been found. I'm writing this now because I need to remember, or maybe because something needs me to remember. The coffee smell is back, stronger than ever. The metallic taste coats my tongue no matter how much water I drink. The blinds cast their lines of light across the room, but the shadows between them seem deeper than they should be. The humming has stopped. That should be a relief, but it's not. The silence feels expectant, like the pause before thunder. Something is about to happen, or maybe it already has and I'm just catching up to it. I can feel eyes on me as I write this, not seeing them but feeling their weight, patient, satisfied. The thing that was calling has been answered. The missing piece has been returned to its place. The journal is complete now. Every page filled with handwriting that might be mine. The story is finished, even though I don't understand how it ends. I'm going to stop writing now, not because I want to, but because something else wants to begin. Story 9. I keep trying to remember what happened after I stepped outside that door. The memories come in pieces now, fragments that don't quite fit together like a puzzle someone shook and scattered across the floor of my mind. The fresh air hit my face first. I remember that sensation clearly, almost violently clear, like breathing for the first time in months. But then there's this gap, this hollow space where something should be. I walked down the path, I think. My feet knew where to go even when my mind felt clouded, heavy with something I couldn't name. There was a sound following me, not footsteps exactly, but something rhythmic, mechanical. A humming that seemed to come from inside my skull rather than the world around me. I can still hear it sometimes when I'm trying to sleep, this low, persistent drone that makes my teeth ache. The neighborhood looked wrong that day. I'm certain of this detail, though I can't explain why. The houses stood exactly where they always had, painted the same colors with the same mailboxes and garden gates, but something in the angles felt shifted, like looking at a photograph that's been tilted just enough to make you dizzy without knowing why. I touched the fence post as I passed, metal warm from sunlight that should have been cool in the shade. The sensation burned itself into my palm, and I can still feel that unnatural heat when I press my hand flat against cold surfaces now. Why did I touch it? I never touch things when I walk, never. There was a woman in a window across the street. She wasn't moving, just standing there behind the glass with her hands pressed flat against it. Her mouth was open like she was calling out, but no sound reached me through that humming in my head. I waved, I think, or maybe I just lifted my hand and she mistook it for a greeting. When I looked back, the window was empty, but the handprints remained on the glass. My shadow fell wrong on the sidewalk, too long in some places, completely absent in others, despite the clear sky overhead. I kept looking down at it, this broken outline of myself that seemed to move independently, reaching toward things I wasn't reaching for, turning when I walked straight ahead. The smell hit me 3 blocks from home. Copper and ozone, like the air before a thunderstorm, but sharper, more personal. It clung to my clothes, my hair, the inside of my nostrils until I could taste it on my tongue. I've smelled it since then, in quiet moments when I'm not expecting it, and it always brings back that same feeling of walking towards something I shouldn't approach. I must have kept walking because I remember being farther from home, in a part of the neighborhood I didn't recognize despite having lived here for years. The houses looked familiar individually, but arranged wrong, like someone had picked up entire buildings and set them down in new patterns while I wasn't paying attention. There was a man standing at the corner. He wore a dark coat that hung too loose on his frame, and when he turned to look at me, his face was exactly like mine. Not similar, not reminiscent, identical. He smiled with my smile and nodded with my gesture, then walked away in the direction I had come from. I should have followed him. I should have demanded answers. Instead, I stood there until he disappeared, and then I couldn't remember which direction he had gone. The humming grew louder, inside my bones now, vibrating through my rib cage and into my lungs until each breath felt mechanical, forced. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound didn't diminish. If anything, it became more complex, layered with voices I almost recognized speaking words I couldn't quite understand. I found myself in front of a door I had never seen before. Red paint peeling in long strips, brass handle tarnished green with age. But when I reached for it, my hand moved with practiced familiarity, turning the handle with the exact pressure and angle needed to open it quietly. The door swung inward, revealing darkness that seemed too deep for the small space beyond. I stepped inside. This I remember with absolute certainty, though everything after becomes confused, overlapping like multiple photographs exposed on the same piece of film. The air was thick enough to swim through, and it tasted of metal and electricity. My footsteps echoed in patterns that made no geometric sense, as if the room extended far beyond what my eyes could measure. There were others there. I can't see their faces when I try to remember, but I can feel their presence, their attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They were waiting for something, expecting something from me that I didn't understand. One of them spoke, and the voice was my own voice, coming from a throat that wasn't mine. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all showing the same scene from slightly different angles. A person walking down a sidewalk, touching a fence post, waving at a window, standing at a corner. The person in the photographs was me, but taken from impossible vantage points, angles that would require the photographer to be floating above the street or standing inside solid objects. In every photograph, my shadow fell wrong. I reached out to touch one of the pictures, and my hand passed through the wall as if it were made of water. The sensation traveled up my arm, cold and electric, and suddenly I was back outside, standing on the sidewalk with no memory of leaving the room or even finding the door again. The sun had moved, not gradually the way it should, but in a sudden jump that left me disoriented and nauseous. The shadows of the houses now pointed in the opposite direction, though I couldn't have been inside for more than a few minutes. My watch had stopped, its hands frozen at an impossible angle that formed no recognizable time. I walked home through streets that had rearranged themselves again. The fence post I had touched was gone, replaced by a hedge that looked decades old. The woman's handprints had multiplied on the window, dozens of them overlapping until the glass was opaque with smeared impressions. The house with the red door was nowhere to be found, though I searched every street in widening circles until my feet began to bleed inside my shoes. When I finally reached my own door, the lock turned with the same easy motion I remembered from that morning, but the interior had changed in subtle ways that took me hours to identify. The dust on the mantel had been disturbed, rearranged into patterns that looked almost like writing in a language I didn't recognize. The unopened newspaper now showed headlines I had never seen, reporting events that couldn't have happened. The clock's missing ticks had multiplied, creating gaps of silence that stretched too long between each measured second. I sat in my chair and tried to make sense of what had happened. The humming had followed me home, weaving itself into the familiar sounds of the house until I couldn't distinguish between what belonged and what had been added. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photographs, that impossible documentation of my walk through a neighborhood that couldn't exist. The dreams started that night, not dreams exactly, but a continuation of the day that played behind my eyelids whether I was sleeping or awake. I walked the same route endlessly, touched the same fence post, waved at the same window, met the same man with my face who smiled with my smile and walked away with my walk. But in the dreams, I could see what the photographs had captured, the watchers positioned in impossible spaces, documenting every step with equipment that hummed with the same frequency that had invaded my skull. I began to suspect that the walk had never ended, that I was still out there somewhere, trapped in that loop of familiar streets rearranged into alien patterns, while something else had returned home to sit in my chair and try to remember what had happened. The thing that looked like me, that moved through my house with practiced familiarity, that wore my memories like an ill-fitting coat. The handwriting in the dust changes every day now. The messages grow longer, more complex, written in that same unrecognizable script that might be language or might be something else entirely. I've tried to photograph them, but the camera captures only smooth, undisturbed surfaces, as if the writing exists in a spectrum of light my equipment cannot detect. Sometimes I catch my reflection moving independently in mirrors, waving at windows I'm not looking through, walking down sidewalks while I sit perfectly still. The humming has become constant now, a background frequency that colors every sound until I can no longer remember what silence feels like. I know I'm supposed to go back. The red door is waiting somewhere in the maze of rearranged streets, and the watchers are still there with their impossible cameras, documenting something that hasn't finished happening yet. Part of me never left that room, never passed through the wall like water, never found my way back to streets that pretend to be familiar. The photographs are multiplying. I find them now in books I haven't opened, between pages that should contain words but instead show image after image of myself walking toward something I can't remember reaching. In every picture, my shadow falls wrong, pointing toward a destination that exists outside the frame, beyond the edges of what can be captured or understood. I think I'm ready to remember now. The fragments are arranging themselves into patterns, and the patterns are forming shapes I almost recognize. The door is calling, and the humming has become a song, and the watchers are waiting for me to complete whatever began when I stepped outside and felt fresh air hit my face like breathing for the first time. Something is waking up inside the spaces between my memories, and it knows the way home. Story 10. It wasn't the first time I noticed the mail piling up. The letters lay scattered, each addressed in that neat, familiar scrawl, yet nobody seemed in a hurry to gather them. The sun filtered through the curtains in an odd way, casting lines that didn't quite meet the floor where they should. The coffee pot gurgled quietly, a sign of a morning like any other, though the clock's hands didn't move past 8. I brushed crumbs from the counter, fleeting reminders of a breakfast uneaten. Outside, the grass grew uneven, untouched for weeks, yet it seemed to bother no one. I left the door slightly ajar when I went out, more out of habit than necessity. The dream started simple enough. I was lying in bed, the same bed I'd slept in for years, but there was a light coming from somewhere above. Not the ceiling light, not the lamp by the nightstand. This was different, oval-shaped, pulsing softly like something breathing. It cast no shadows on the walls, just hung there in the darkness above me, patient and still. I remember thinking it was stress. Work had been demanding lately, though I couldn't quite recall what kind of work I did. The details felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. When I woke up, the light was gone, of course. Just the familiar ceiling staring back at me, textured and ordinary. I made coffee, checked the mail, went about my day. The dream faded like they always do. But it came back. The second time the light was brighter, more insistent. I could hear something too, a low hum that seemed to come from inside my own head, like someone tuning a radio to a frequency only I could receive. The sound made my teeth ache in a way I'd never felt before, sweet and metallic, like copper pennies dissolving on my tongue. In the dream, I tried to sit up, but my body wouldn't respond. Not paralyzed exactly, just heavy, impossibly heavy. The light pulsed faster now, and I could feel myself being lifted, though no part of me actually moved. The sensation was gentle but wrong, like floating in water that wasn't wet. There was a voice then, distant and muffled, speaking words I couldn't quite catch. The tone was familiar, almost conversational, as if someone was explaining something important that I should already know. I strained to listen, but the harder I focused, the more the words seemed to slip away. When I woke up, my mouth tasted like metal. I found myself checking things throughout the day. Small things, the position of objects on my dresser, the angle of the bathroom mirror, the way my shoes were arranged by the door. Everything looked normal, but normal in a way that felt deliberately arranged, like someone had been careful to put everything back exactly where it belonged. The third dream lasted longer. Hours, it seemed, though dreams don't really follow that kind of logic. The light was so bright now that it should have hurt my eyes, but instead it felt warm and encompassing. The humming had become a symphony of frequencies, each one perfectly calibrated to resonate through my bones. I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. The walls had dissolved into something that wasn't quite darkness and wasn't quite space. I could sense movement around me, purposeful and methodical. The voice was clearer now, though still not clear enough. It spoke in measured tones about procedures and protocols, about integration and adjustment periods. My body felt different, lighter, as if parts of me were being gently rearranged, optimized, improved. There was no pain, only a deep sense of transformation that felt both alien and strangely comforting, like coming home to a place I'd never been before. I tried to speak, to ask questions, but my voice came out as that same metallic humming. The sound surprised me, not because it was wrong, but because it felt so right. When I woke up, there was a small mark on my arm, perfectly round, about the size of a dime, with no memory of how it got there. It didn't hurt or itch. It was just there, like it had always been there, like I'd simply failed to notice it before. The days began to blur together after that. I'd find myself standing in rooms with no memory of walking into them. Conversations would end mid-sentence, leaving me staring at empty spaces where people had been moments before. The radio in my kitchen would tune itself to stations that broadcast nothing but static, yet somehow the static felt meaningful, like a language I was on the verge of understanding. I started keeping a journal, trying to track the inconsistencies, but when I'd read back through my entries, they described things I couldn't remember writing. Details about procedures and examinations, about the taste of recycled air and the feeling of being gently restrained. The handwriting was mine, but the experiences felt borrowed from someone else's life. The dreams weren't dreams anymore, they were appointments, scheduled visits to a place that existed in the space between sleeping and waking, where the light never dimmed and the voices never stopped their patient explanations. I began to look forward to them, these sessions where I was carefully tended to, where every discomfort was immediately addressed, where I was being prepared for something important. During the day, I'd catch glimpses of the light in my peripheral vision, quick flashes that would vanish the moment I turned to look directly. The humming would start up at random moments, usually when I was alone, usually when I was trying to remember something just out of reach. My reflection in mirrors began to look unfamiliar, not different exactly, just optimized, improved, better. People stopped visiting, the phone stopped ringing, the mail continued to pile up, but I no longer felt the need to collect it. The outside world was becoming less relevant, less pressing. There were more important things to focus on now. The integration was almost complete. I realized I'd been selected, chosen for something extraordinary. The dreams weren't random neural firings or stress responses. They were invitations, gentle introductions to a process that had been ongoing for longer than I could remember, maybe longer than anyone could remember. The marks on my body multiplied, each one perfectly placed, each one serving a purpose I was beginning to understand without being told. My sleep schedule adjusted itself automatically. I'd find myself lying down at precisely the right moment, closing my eyes just as the light began to appear. The voice was clearer now. It spoke about integration percentages and compatibility matrices, about the success of the program and the importance of willing participation. It thanked me for my cooperation, though I couldn't remember ever agreeing to anything. But then again, maybe agreement wasn't something that happened consciously. Maybe it was something deeper, something that occurred at a cellular level. I stopped trying to distinguish between dreams and reality. The categories had become meaningless. There was only the ongoing process, the careful cultivation of something new and improved. The old concerns, the old anxieties were being systematically addressed and resolved. I was becoming something better than what I had been. Last night I had the dream again. The same oval light, the same gentle lifting sensation, the same patient voices explaining procedures I was finally beginning to understand. But when I reached up to touch the light, something I'd never been able to do before, my hand passed right through it. Because I wasn't dreaming anymore. The light was real, the voices were real, the gentle restraints holding me in place were real, and when I looked down at my body, I could see the improvements they'd been making, the careful modifications that had been occurring during all those sessions I'd mistaken for dreams. I tried to remember my life before, but those memories felt distant and unimportant now. Like stories someone had told me about a person I'd never met, the integration was complete, the process was finished. But as I lay there, finally understanding what had happened to me, I noticed something that didn't fit, something that shouldn't have been possible. On the metal surface beside me, scattered and forgotten, were letters addressed in that neat, familiar scrawl. The same letters that had been piling up in my kitchen for weeks. The same letters that were still piling up there now, in a house I was no longer in a life I was no longer living. The light pulsed gently above me, patient and eternal, as I tried to understand how the mail could be in both places at once.